Diane Collier was 44 years old when Brett Langford left her sitting in a locked car outside a bar at 1 a.m. with a dead phone and no explanation. He walked back inside, and she never saw him come back out. She drove to the only place she could think of, her grandmother's farm, 40 miles outside Harlan County. And when she pulled up that gravel driveway at nearly 2 in the morning, Nana June's kitchen light was on. It had always been on. And in the weeks that followed, when Diane decided she wasn't leaving, when she told herself she was going to do something with that crumbling old property that hadn't turned a real profit in years, everyone who loved her told her she was making the worst mistake of her life. She had no money, no plan, and no idea what she was doing. What she had was a food science degree she hadn't used in 15 years, a grandmother who believed in her, and soul that most people would have walked away from without a second look. This is Diane's story. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The night it ended, Diane wasn't even sure what they were fighting about anymore. That was the thing about 6 years with Brett. The arguments had a way of blurring together, each one borrowing ammunition from the last, until you couldn't remember what had started any of them. She knew it had begun at dinner. Something about her being too quiet at the table with his friends, or maybe not quiet enough. She could no longer keep track of which version of herself he wanted on any given evening. By the time they'd moved to the bar on Clement Street, the silence between them had gone from uncomfortable to something colder. Brett ordered a round for the table and didn't order anything for Diane. He said he forgot his wallet inside. He said he'd be 2 minutes. He handed her his keys and went back through the door. Diane sat in the passenger seat of his car and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 15, then 40. She tried calling his phone and got voicemail. She tried texting and watched the messages stack up with no response. The bar's neon sign buzzed in the window, and people filtered in and out past the car, laughing and loud, and Diane sat there in the dark realizing that she had been deliberately left. Her own phone was at 6% battery and dropping. She didn't have enough charge to call a rideshare, didn't have the number of anyone at that table memorized, and didn't have enough dignity left to walk back inside and ask Brett's friends if they knew where he'd gone. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the car, and pulled out of the parking lot. She drove for 20 minutes without any real destination before she realized where her hands were taking her. The highway heading southeast. The long road that stretched out past the edge of the city and into the dark stretches of rural Harlan County. She'd driven it so many times as a kid that her body seemed to remember it without her having to think. Past the gas station with the broken "are on its" sign, past the volunteer fire station, past the white church that sat alone in a field like it had been placed there by accident. "Come in," she said. "I'll put more water on." Diane sat at the kitchen table and cried for a long time without saying anything. And Nana June sat across from her and didn't try to fill the silence with questions or comfort or advice. She just sat there, warm and solid and present, the way she had always been. Outside, the farm was dark and quiet. The old barn at the edge of the property was just a silhouette against the sky. The fields beyond it were overgrown and silver under the moon. When Diane finally stopped crying, she looked up and said, "I don't have anywhere to go." Nana June wrapped both hands around her mug. "You're here, aren't you? I mean, after this. I don't have. Brett and I have been living in his apartment for 2 years. Everything I have is there." She paused. "I don't even know if he's going to be there when I go back. I don't know if I want him to be." Nana June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long has it been bad?" Diane thought about it honestly for probably the first time. 3 years, she said. Maybe 4. Nana June nodded, unsurprised. She'd met Brett twice. She'd been polite both times and hadn't said much either way, which Diane now understood had been its own kind of commentary. Nana June had a long-established policy of not telling people what she thought about their partners unless she was asked directly and repeatedly. "You can stay here as long as you need," Nana June said. "You know that." Diane looked out through the kitchen window at the dark shape of the barn. "The farm," she said slowly. "How is it doing?" There was a pause, just short enough to be telling. "It's managing," Nana June said. But managing was not the word Diane would have used once the sun came up, and she walked the property for the first time in 4 years. The east field was completely fallow, the soil dry, and cracked along the surface in a way that suggested it hadn't been properly turned in at least 2 seasons. The old vegetable beds along the south fence were buried under weeds so thick they'd choked out everything beneath them. The greenhouse, a small glass and timber structure Nana June's husband had built in the 1980s, had 2 broken panes and a door hinge that had rusted completely through. The barn roof had a visible sag on the left side that hadn't been there the last time Diane visited. Nana June was 79 years old and had been running this property largely alone since Diane's grandfather passed 6 years ago. She had a part-time neighbor named Earl who helped with heavy equipment a few times a year, and she kept a small kitchen garden going near the house. But the wider farm, the 3 acres of growing fields, the old orchard, the greenhouse, had been slowly going quiet for years. Diane stood in the middle of the east field with the morning sun on her face and dirt on the hem of her jeans and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not optimism exactly, more like recognition. The way you feel when you walk into a room you haven't been in for years and realize you still know exactly where everything is. She'd grown up on this farm every summer from age 6 to 16. She knew the way the soil ran heavier with clay toward the creek side and sandier near the road. She knew the old apple trees and the orchard still produced if you pruned them right in late winter. She knew the south-facing greenhouse could hold heat even in January if the panes were intact. She knew things about this land that she hadn't consciously remembered knowing, things that had just been sitting quietly in the back of her head for 15 years while she worked marketing jobs in the city and told herself she'd figure out what she really wanted to do eventually. She pulled out her phone, fully charged now, plugged into Nana June's kitchen outlet since 2 a.m., and saw 14 missed messages from Brett. She read the first 3. They ran the usual course. First irritated, then defensive, then something that was trying to approximate an apology without quite committing to one. She put the phone back in her pocket and kept walking. She didn't call him back that day, or the next. Diane hadn't always been someone who waited in parked cars. There was a version of her from 15 years ago that her current self would have had a hard time recognizing. Not because that woman was so different in appearance or personality, but because she carried herself differently. She took up more space. She had opinions about things and stated them without first checking whether the room wanted to hear them. She laughed loudly and didn't apologize for it afterward. That version of Diane graduated from the University of Kentucky in 2003 with a degree in food science, a concentration in fermentation and preservation, and a thesis project on small batch vinegar production using native fruit varieties that her advisor called one of the most practically applicable student papers he'd read in a decade. She'd spent 4 years learning the chemistry of food at its most elemental level. How microbes transform raw ingredients, how acidity develops, how flavor compounds build and break down over time, how something as simple as a piece of fruit in a jar could become something genuinely valuable with enough patience and knowledge. She had plans, specific ones. She'd been accepted to a graduate program at Cornell's Food Science Department, a 2-year master's program with a focus on artisanal food production and sustainable agriculture. She'd applied on a near whim during her senior year, half convinced she wouldn't get in, and when the acceptance letter arrived, she'd read it 3 times, standing in the hallway of her apartment, and then called Nana June before she called anyone else. Nana June had said, "Well, of course they accepted you. Now go." Diane deferred enrollment for 1 year to save money. That year, she met Brett. She met him at a work event. She was temping at a corporate office downtown while saving for grad school, and Brett was there in a good suit, being confident and funny and easy to talk to. He was 31 to her 23, already running a small property management company, the kind of man who seemed to have figured out something about life that most people her age were still fumbling toward. He asked for her number at the end of the evening and called the next day, which was not something men her age tended to do. Their first 6 months were good. She would say that honestly now, without needing to revise it. Brett could be generous and attentive when things were easy between them, and in those early months things were mostly easy. He took her to good restaurants and remembered small details she mentioned in passing and made her feel in a way she hadn't quite felt before, like someone worth paying close attention to. When she told him about Cornell, he listened carefully and then asked what the program would actually lead to, practically speaking. She talked about her plan to eventually start a small batch food production operation, maybe something built around the farm in Harlan County, preserves and fermented products using native ingredients. He nodded slowly in the way that she would later learn meant he had already decided something and was waiting for the right moment to say it. You could do all of that without another degree, he said. You've already got the knowledge. You'd just be spending 2 years and a lot of money to get a piece of paper that confirms what you already know. It sounded reasonable. It was delivered gently, and Diane, who was 24 and in love and not yet practiced at recognizing the particular way Brett had of making his preferences sound like logical conclusions, heard it as good advice from someone who cared about her. She deferred again, and then the deferment window closed and the offer expired quietly, and that was that. She told herself it didn't matter, that she'd find another route. She told herself this sincerely and kept telling herself for years while she worked a series of jobs that used pieces of her skills without ever using all of them. A quality control role at a food manufacturing company, a product development assistant position at a mid-sized grocery chain, a part-time consulting gig doing recipe testing for a small restaurant group. Each job was fine. None of them were what she'd meant to do. Brett's business grew steadily through those years. He bought a second property, then a third, then started managing buildings for other investors. He was good at it, genuinely good, and Diane supported that growth in the ways that were asked of her without those ways ever being formally named. She attended his client dinners and made conversation with his investors' wives and handled the administrative side of their shared life, the scheduling, the household, the social calendar, while telling herself this was just a season and the next one would leave more room for her own work. The next season never came with more room. It always came with more of the same. By the time she was 38, Diane had stopped talking about the food science degree at social events because the gap between what she'd studied and what she currently did had grown wide enough to require explanation, and the explanation always made her feel worse than just staying quiet. She'd shelve herself so gradually she hadn't noticed the shelf going up. Diane spent 3 days at the farm before Brett showed up. He drove out on a Thursday afternoon in his clean, gray sedan, dressed like he was coming from a meeting, which he probably was. Diane watched him pull up from the kitchen window and felt nothing dramatic. No spike of anger, no lurch of longing, just a flat, tired recognition. She went outside before he could knock. "You didn't return my calls," he said. "I know." He looked past her at the farmhouse, taking it in the way he took in most things, assessing, calculating, deciding within seconds whether something was worth his attention. His eyes moved to the sagging barn roof, the overgrown fence line, the cracked greenhouse pane catching light near the back. Something in his expression settled into the mild condescension he reserved for things he considered beneath serious consideration. "Diane." He said her name like it was the beginning of a reasonable argument. "Come home. Whatever happened the other night, we can talk about it. You're staying on an old farm instead of dealing with it, which isn't like you." "It's exactly like me," she said. "You just never noticed." Brett ran a hand through his hair. He did that when he was trying to appear patient. "Your grandmother is almost 80. You can't stay here indefinitely taking care of a property that isn't even yours. She's my family. I'm your family." He said it with complete conviction, the way he said most things, and Diane stood there and waited for the feeling that sentence used to produce and found it wasn't there anymore. It had been leaving for a long time. She just hadn't been standing still enough to notice its absence until now. She told him she needed time. He told her she was being irrational. She told him to drive safely and went back inside. He called 4 more times that evening. She answered the last one and told him clearly that she wasn't coming back to the apartment, that she'd arranged to collect her things when he wasn't home, and that she thought they both knew this had been coming for a while. Brett cycled through irritation and bargaining and a version of remorse that felt more like strategy than feeling. When none of it moved her, he said, "Fine," and hung up. Diane sat with the phone in her hand for a moment and then set it face down on the kitchen table and went to find Nana June. Her grandmother was in the greenhouse, sweeping around the base of the old potting bench with a short-handled broom. The evening light came through the intact panes in long, warm rectangles across the dirt floor. Diane leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a moment before speaking. "I want to stay," Diane said. "Not just for a few weeks. I want to actually stay and do something with this place. If you'll let me." Nana June kept sweeping. "What kind of something?" "The fermentation work I studied at university. Preserves, vinegars, shrubs, fermented sauces. There's a real market for small batch artisan products right now, especially anything with a local provenance story. The orchard alone could supply enough fruit for a solid product line if we brought it back properly. The greenhouse could handle year-round herb production for infused vinegars. The south field." "You've been thinking about this for 3 days," Nana June said. "The orchard needs serious pruning," Nana June said finally. "The east field hasn't been turned in 2 seasons. The greenhouse needs 2 new panes and that door hinge replaced before winter, or it's useless. Earl can help with equipment, but he's not reliable past 2 days a week." "I know. You haven't done physical farm work since you were 16. "I know that too." Nana June looked out through the greenhouse glass at the dark line of apple trees at the far edge of the property. "Your grandfather always said this land had more in it than we were pulling out of it. He just never quite figured out what that was." She paused. "Maybe you will." That was as close to a formal blessing as Nana June gave. Diane called her friend Priya that night and explained the situation in full. Priya listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Diane loved most about her. And when Diane finished, Priya said, "So you're going to go live on a farm and make vinegar, among other things." "Okay," Priya said. "What do you need?" That was also the night Diane called her brother Owen. That conversation went differently. Owen was 47, practical to the point of bluntness, and had always had a soft spot for Brett that Diane had never quite understood. He heard her out and then said, with genuine concern that still managed to land wrong, "Diane, you're 44 years old. You can't just restart your entire life on a farm because your relationship ended. That's not realistic." "Why not?" she asked. He didn't have a clean answer for that. He pivoted to logistics instead, asking about her savings, her health insurance, her income plan, each question reasonable on its own, but assembled together into something that felt more like a wall than a conversation. Diane answered what she could and deflected what she couldn't, and got off the phone feeling the particular exhaustion that came from being loved by someone who expressed it through doubt. She lay in her old childhood bedroom that night, staring at the ceiling with its familiar water-stained shape like a running dog, and she thought about the Cornell acceptance letter she deferred until it expired. She thought about the thesis on native fruit vinegar that her advisor had praised. She thought about 15 years of telling herself there was still time while time kept passing. She thought about Brett's face in the parking lot the next morning, the complete absence of urgency in his decision to leave her there. She got up at 5:30 and went outside before the sun was fully up and stood in the east field in the early gray light with the dew soaking through her sneakers and looked at 3 acres of neglected land and made a decision so quietly that it barely felt like a decision at all. She was staying. She was going to make something here. And she didn't particularly care anymore whether anyone thought that was realistic. Diane had forgotten what real physical work felt like. Not the gym kind, not the controlled discomfort of a 40-minute workout followed by a hot shower and a protein shake. The other kind. The kind where you're on your knees in cold dirt at 7 a.m. pulling weeds by the root with both hands while your lower back registers a formal complaint. And when you stand up 2 hours later, the work you've done looks like almost nothing against the work that remains. The first week was humbling in a way she hadn't anticipated. She started with the south fence line, where the vegetable beds had been swallowed by weeds, pulling and cutting and hauling wheelbarrow loads of dead plant matter to a clearing near the barn where she'd decided to build a compost pile. The weeds came out in varying degrees of resistance. Some pulled clean with a single tug. Others had root systems so established they required a hand fork and both arms and still came out in pieces. Her palms blistered on day 2. By day 4, the blisters had opened, and she wrapped her hands in gardening gloves lined with old socks and kept going. Nana June watched all of this with quiet approval and occasional direction. She knew the land the way you only know something you've worked for 40 years. not as a collection of facts, but as a physical intuition. She'd walk the edge of a field and say things like, "This corner drains slow, plant nothing here that doesn't like wet feet," or "The soil goes good again about 10 yards past that post." And Diane wrote everything down in a notebook she kept in her back pocket, filling pages with observations and measurements and questions. She retrieved her old food science textbooks from a storage unit in Lexington, along with boxes of notes from her university years. Reading them again was strange, like finding a conversation she'd been in the middle of and simply walked away from. The knowledge was all still there, waiting. Fermentation chemistry, preservation science, the specific pH ranges that made certain microbial cultures thrive, the way acidity interacted with different fruit varieties during extended maceration. She'd learned all of it once and retained more than she'd expected. The years of working adjacent to food production had kept the knowledge from going completely cold. She set up a small working table in the greenhouse and began testing soil samples from different sections of the property. Using a basic kit, she ordered online and cross-referencing the results against her old textbooks. The east field ran acidic, which ruled out certain crops, but actually suited several of the heritage apple varieties in the orchard. The south field was more balanced, good for brassicas and root vegetables, and several herb varieties she had in mind for infused vinegar production. The creekside section was heavy clay, poor for most cultivation, but potentially useful for certain moisture-loving plants she hadn't fully planned for yet. The orchard needed the most urgent attention. 12 apple trees, 3 pear, 2 quince. Several of the apple trees had years of unpruned growth crossing and competing, branches rubbing together and creating entry points for disease. Diane watched 3 YouTube tutorials on winter pruning before touching a single tree, then spent a full day with loppers and a folding saw working through the most congested growth, cutting back to outward-facing buds, opening the canopy to light and air. Her arms ached by noon. By 4 p.m., she'd done 4 trees and had to stop because she genuinely couldn't lift the loppers above her shoulders anymore. She sat on an overturned crate and looked at what she'd done and felt something shift in her chest. The 4 pruned trees looked different already, cleaner, more deliberate, the kind of structured openness that suggested intention rather than neglect. She could see what the whole orchard would look like when the work was finished. She hadn't been able to see things like that in a long time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Nana June brought her tea without being asked and sat on an old wooden chair nearby while Diane drank it. "Your grandfather pruned those same trees every February," Nana June said, looking at the orchard. "First 20 years we were here, without fail. Then his back went, and he couldn't manage the ladder anymore, and we let it go. I always meant to get someone in to do it properly, and somehow never did." "They'll produce again," Diane said. "Give them one good season of proper pruning, and they'll come back." Nana June looked at her over the rim of her own mug. "You sound sure of that? The root systems are intact. The trees aren't dead, they're just crowded. Give something enough room and the right conditions, and it'll do what it was always meant to do." She wasn't only talking about the trees, and they both knew it. The greenhouse repairs took a full weekend. Diane sourced replacement panes from a glass supplier in Harlan, watched a tutorial on how to set them properly with glazing compound, and did the work herself with only 2 minor cuts and one genuinely alarming moment when a pane shifted unexpectedly, and she caught it by instinct rather than skill. The door hinge she replaced in an afternoon. By Sunday evening, the greenhouse was sealed and functional. And when she stood inside it with the late afternoon sun heating the glass around her, she felt the specific satisfaction of having fixed something real with her own hands. She drafted her first proper production plan that night at the kitchen table, while Nana June watched the evening news in the next room. The plan was modest by design. She knew better than to overcalculate what she could realistically manage alone in year 1. A core line of 3 or 4 products built around the orchard fruit. Apple cider vinegar aged properly, not the quick commercial kind, but the long-fermented variety with genuine complexity. A quince preserve using a low-sugar method that let the fruit's natural flavor carry. A fruit shrub, which was a drinking vinegar made from fruit sugar, and raw vinegar, the kind of thing that small artisan food companies were actively sourcing. She had the knowledge. She had the raw ingredients coming back to life 30 yards from the kitchen door. What she needed now was equipment, time, and the particular kind of stubbornness that didn't mistake exhaustion for a reason to stop. She had all three. The first batch of apple cider vinegar Diane made was terrible. Not dangerous, just wrong. Flat and thin, with an off note she couldn't immediately identify. The kind of result that told her the fermentation environment had been inconsistent, probably a temperature fluctuation during the secondary stage when the alcohol was converting to acetic acid. She poured it out, scrubbed the fermentation vessel clean, documented every variable she could think of, and started again. The second batch was better. The third was right. That was how the first 6 months went. Methodical, incremental, full of small failures that were useful and small successes that kept her going. Diane worked the kind of hours that stopped feeling long because the distinction between working and not working had quietly dissolved. She was up before 6 most mornings, out in the orchard or the fields or the greenhouse until the light went, then inside processing, bottling, labeling, or reading until late. Her hands stayed rough and her back stayed sore, and she slept without difficulty for the first time in years. The orchard came back faster than she dared hope. Diane was immediately cautious. Her trust in people's motives had taken a substantial hit in the past year, and she'd developed a habit of waiting before deciding what to make of someone. Hector seemed to understand this without being told. He didn't ask to look around. He stood by his truck and said he'd heard she was doing fermentation work with orchard fruit, and that he knew a few things about small batch food production certification that might save her some time if she was interested. He said it plainly, without the particular enthusiasm of someone trying to sell something, and then waited. Diane showed him the orchard. He walked it quietly, hands in his pockets, occasionally crouching to examine something at ground level. He asked a few specific questions about her pruning method and her soil amendment approach, and listened to her answers with the focused attention of someone who actually processed what they were hearing rather than waiting for their turn to speak. At the end of the walk, he said her pruning cuts were clean and her orchard would be fully productive within 2 seasons, which was about as affirming as Diane imagined Hector Pruitt got. She showed him the greenhouse operation and the fermentation setup she'd built along one wall of the barn. A row of large glass vessels at different stages of the vinegar-making process, each labeled with start dates and temperature logs. He examined her documentation and said, "You're running this like a proper production facility." "That's the goal," Diane said. "Then you'll need food safety certification before you can sell commercially. And if you want premium pricing, organic certification on the orchard and growing areas is worth pursuing. It's a process, but it's manageable. I've helped producers through it before." He offered to help her navigate both certification tracks, visiting once or twice a week to consult. He was clear that he wasn't looking for payment, that he was retired and found the work interesting and needed something to engage with. Diane studied him for a long moment. "This is my operation," she said. "My decisions. Wouldn't have it any other way," Hector said. 3 weeks after Hector started coming by, he introduced Diane to Dr. Miriam Okafor. Dr. Okafor was a food chemist at the University of Kentucky who specialized in fermentation science and the bioactive compounds in traditionally produced vinegars. Hector had worked with her department on a previous extension project and had mentioned Diane's operation during a phone call. Dr. Okafor had asked to visit. She arrived on a Friday afternoon, younger than Diane had expected, direct in a way of someone who had no patience for pleasantries but plenty of patience for interesting problems. She tasted Diane's aged apple cider vinegar from a small glass, held it in her mouth for a moment, and then asked 3 rapid questions about fermentation temperature, mother culture origin, and aging vessel material. Diane answered all 3 in detail. Dr. Okafor set the glass down and said, "The acetic acid concentration in this is higher than commercial equivalents, and the polyphenol profile is going to be interesting. Where are these apples from?" Diane pointed out the kitchen window toward the orchard. "How old are the trees?" "Oldest ones are about 40 years. Heritage varieties, not commercial stock." Dr. Okafor looked at the orchard through the window with an expression that Diane was starting to recognize as scientific interest working hard to stay professional. She asked if she could collect samples to run formal analysis on. Diane said yes. The results came back 6 weeks later. The bioactive compound concentration in Diane's vinegar was measurably higher than commercial equivalents. A function, Dr. Okafor explained, of the heritage apple varieties, the long fermentation timeline, and a specific microbial culture that had developed in Diane's aging vessels, shaped by the particular conditions of that barn in that specific location. The stressed, slow, low-intervention process that conventional food production would have considered inefficient had produced something genuinely distinctive. Dr. Okafor asked if Diane would be willing to be included in a research study on traditional fermentation methods and their effect on bioactive compound development. Diane agreed, and within a month there were graduate students visiting the farm on a regular basis, running measurements and taking samples and documenting her methods with a thoroughness that Diane found both flattering and slightly surreal. She was 44 years old, and her farm had become a research site. That same month, she got an email from a woman named Linda Fong. Linda Fong ran a small artisan food company called Hollow Creek Provisions out of Lexington. She'd been sourcing small-batch fermented products for her catalog for 3 years, and had been forwarded Dr. Okafor's preliminary research notes by a colleague in the food science department who thought the profile of Diane's vinegar matched what Linda had been looking for. Linda was direct in her email, no flattery, just specifics. She described exactly what she was looking for, the volume, the quality standards, the pricing range she worked within, and asked if Diane would be willing to meet. They met at the farm on a Tuesday morning. Linda walked the orchard and the greenhouse and the barn fermentation setup with the practiced eye of someone who'd visited enough small producers to know immediately what was real and what was performance. She tasted 6 products: the aged apple cider vinegar, the quince preserve, 2 shrub varieties, an herb-infused vinegar, and a small test batch of pear vinegar that Diane hadn't officially added to her line yet. Linda tasted the pear vinegar twice. "This isn't ready for the catalog," she said. "I know," Diane said. "It needs another 2 months in the vessel." Linda nodded, apparently satisfied by the answer. They talked for 2 hours at the kitchen table, while Nana June moved quietly around them, making tea and pretending not to listen. By the end of the conversation, Linda had offered Diane a supplier contract for the apple cider vinegar, the quince preserve, and 1 shrub variety to start, with the option to expand the line as production scaled. The contract wouldn't make Diane wealthy. It would cover her operating costs and Nana June's property taxes and leave a modest amount to reinvest in equipment and expanding the growing areas. After 18 months of living on savings that were draining faster than she liked to admit, it was enough to make the whole thing feel real in a way it hadn't quite before. She signed the contract on a Thursday. Brett called on Friday. She hadn't heard from him in 4 months, since a final exchange of logistics around collecting her belongings from his apartment. His number came up on her phone, and she almost didn't answer, and then she did. His tone was friendly in the way that immediately put her guard up. He asked how she was, said he'd heard she was doing something interesting with the farm, said a mutual acquaintance had mentioned she'd been working with a university researcher. He was building towards something and not being subtle about it. "What do you want, Brett?" she said. She told him no and ended the call. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from an attorney representing Brett Langford. The letter claimed that during their 6-year relationship, Diane had benefited financially from Brett's support in ways that constituted an informal partnership, and that since Brett's encouragement and financial stability had enabled Diane to pursue her current business venture, he was entitled to a share of the farm's revenue and any future valuation increase in the property. The legal language was dense and confident-sounding and almost entirely without merit, which Diane's attorney confirmed within 24 hours of reading it. "He has no case," her attorney said flatly. "You weren't married. The farm belongs to your grandmother. You built this operation on your own funds and your own labor. There's no legal theory here that holds up. Then why send the letter? Because letters are cheap and lawsuits are expensive to defend. He's betting you'll pay him something to make it go away." Diane looked at her attorney across the desk. "I'm not paying him anything." Then we respond and prepare for him to escalate. He escalated. Over the following 3 months, Brett's legal team filed 2 motions, requested extensive financial documentation, and scheduled a deposition that required Diane to spend a full day away from the farm in a conference room answering questions about her relationship history and financial decisions, while Brett's attorney worked methodically through 6 years of her life trying to find a thread worth pulling. Owen called during this period. His tone carried the particular weight of someone who believed they were being reasonable. "Diane, I talked to Brett. He's not trying to hurt you. He just feels like he contributed to where you are and deserves some acknowledgement of that. He left me in a parking lot at 1 a.m., Diane said. "I know, and he knows I was wrong. But relationships are complicated. You were together 6 years. He supported you financially during some of that time. Maybe there's a middle ground here." "There isn't," Diane said. Owen pushed a little harder, suggesting she was letting pride get in the way of a practical solution, that fighting a lawsuit was expensive and stressful and not worth the principle. Diane listened until he finished and then said, "Owen, I need you to hear this clearly. I spent 15 years making myself smaller to keep a man comfortable. I deferred my graduate program twice because Brett thought it was unnecessary. I spent 6 years building his life instead of mine. I'm not giving him $1 of what I've built here. Not one." Owen was quiet for a long moment. "I hear you," he said finally, with less certainty than he'd had at the start of the call. The lawsuit ground on through autumn, eating time and money and mental energy that Diane couldn't afford to lose. She kept working through all of it, kept meeting her production schedule for Linda, kept the graduate students coming, kept Hector's weekly visits on the calendar. She didn't let Brett's legal harassment stop the farm's forward movement, but she felt its weight every day. The way a stone in your shoe doesn't stop you walking, but changes every step. Then Priya called with news about a reporter named Troy Ashworth. Troy Ashworth wrote for the Lexington Herald-Leader. He covered food, agriculture, and rural economy stories across central and eastern Kentucky, and he'd been pointed toward Diane's farm by Dr. Okafor, who'd mentioned it during a phone interview about her fermentation research as an example of what she called genuinely interesting small-scale production happening outside the usual channels. Troy had followed up with a brief email asking if Diane would be willing to talk for a piece on artisan food production in rural Kentucky. Diane almost said no. She was mid-lawsuit, behind on one production batch because of a deposition that had eaten 2 full days, and deeply uninterested in drawing attention to herself, while Brett's legal team was still looking for angles. She mentioned this to Hector, who listened and then said simply, "Sunlight is usually the best disinfectant for this kind of legal harassment. Your call, but think about it." She thought about it for 4 days and then emailed Troy back. He came out on a Wednesday, arriving in a sensible car with a recorder and a notebook and the unhurried manner of a journalist who'd learned not to rush the people he was writing about. He walked the farm with Diane for 2 hours before asking a single formal question, listening to her talk about the orchard and the fermentation process and the soil composition and the heritage apple varieties with the genuine attention of someone who found the subject interesting rather than just usable. When they sat down at the kitchen table, Nana, June brought out a small plate of food without being asked, bread, a dish of quince preserve, a small bottle of the apple cider vinegar with a glass. Troy tasted everything carefully and wrote something in his notebook. He asked Diane about her background, her food science degree, the 15 years between graduation and the farm. She answered honestly, including Brett, including the deferred Cornell program, including the parking lot at 1 a.m. She decided before he arrived that she wasn't going to soften any of it, that if she was going to tell the story, she was going to tell it straight and let it stand on its own. Troy was a careful journalist. He didn't editorialize during the interview, just listened and noted and occasionally asked a follow-up that showed he'd been paying close attention. Near the end, he asked, almost casually, whether there were any obstacles she was currently navigating with the business. The headline was straightforward. She left a bad relationship with nothing. Now her farm is a research site and her ex want to cut. Troy had done his work thoroughly. The piece included quotes from Dr. Okafor about the agricultural and scientific significance of Diane's operation, a quote from Linda Fong describing Hollow Creek Provisions' experience working with her as a supplier, and several paragraphs from Hector about what Diane had accomplished on genuinely difficult land with limited resources. The lawsuit was covered in clear, specific terms. Troy had pulled the court filings, which were public record, and laid out Brett's legal claims alongside a quote from a family law attorney Troy had consulted independently, who described the case as having no credible legal foundation and characterized it as an attempt to extract settlement money through litigation costs. Brett was not quoted in the piece. His attorney had declined to comment. The article ran on a Sunday. By Monday morning, Diane had 47 emails from people she didn't know. By Wednesday, the piece had been shared widely enough that Priya texted her a screenshot of it appearing in a national food and agriculture newsletter with a note attached calling it one of the better rural food production stories they'd read that year. The tone of the public response was not favorable to Brett. Diane watched it all from a careful distance, continuing to work, continuing to fill orders, trying not to let the noise of sudden attention disrupt the rhythm she'd built. Hector told her to keep her head down and keep producing. Dr. Okafor sent a brief email saying she was glad the work was getting attention and to expect more inquiries from the academic side. Linda Fong called to say that Hollow Creek Provisions website traffic had tripled since the article ran and that she was fielding questions from retailers about expanding the Diane's products in their catalog. 19 days after the article published, Brett's attorney filed to withdraw the lawsuit. Diane's attorney called her with the news on a Thursday afternoon while she was in the barn checking fermentation vessels. "It's done," her attorney said. "Dismissed without prejudice." "He's walking away." Diane stood in the barn with her phone in her hand and looked at the row of glass vessels holding months of careful work. The slow amber liquid inside, each one developing complexity at its own pace, unbothered by anything happening outside the barn walls. "Good," she said. She went back to checking the vessels. The legal fight had cost her money she hadn't planned to spend and time she couldn't get back, but the farm was intact, the contract with Linda was intact, and the research partnership with Dr. Okafor was intact. Brett had gotten nothing. More than that, he'd handed her story a second chapter that made the first one land harder, and the attention that came from that chapter opened doors she hadn't known to look for. The emails kept coming through the following weeks. Women mostly, though not exclusively, people who'd read the article and wanted to say something about it. Some shared their own versions of the same story, relationships that had cost them years, skills they'd set aside, restarts they were afraid to attempt. Others asked practical questions about fermentation, about small farm production, about how to begin. A few asked if they could visit. Diane read every email. She answered most of them. One afternoon, Hector sat across from her at the kitchen table while she worked through her inbox and said, "You know what this is, don't you? There's a program here if you want it. People want to learn what you're doing." Diane looked up from her laptop. "A workshop," Hector said. "Nothing elaborate. One weekend, hands-on, focused on fermentation basics and small-scale production. I'd wager you'd fill it without trying." Diane looked back at her screen, at the stack of emails from people who wanted to know how she'd done what she'd done. "Let me finish the season first," she said, but she was already thinking about it. The first workshop Diane ran had 16 people in it. She'd advertised it simply, a weekend introduction to small batch fermentation and artisan food production, held on the farm, limited spots, no experience necessary. She expected maybe 8 registrations. She got 31 in the first week and had to close the wait list. She capped the first session at 16, promised a second date to everyone else, and spent 2 weeks preparing a curriculum that moved from soil and orchard basics in the morning to fermentation science and hands-on production in the afternoon. The participants ranged from 38 to 71. Most were women. Several had driven more than 2 hours to get there. A few had read the Herald Leader article. Others had found the farm through Dr. Okafor's research mentions or through Hollow Creek Provision social media, where Linda had posted about her supplier with enough specificity that people had gone looking. Diane taught the weekend herself, with Hector handling the orchard and soil sections and Nana, June, moving through the group with the easy authority of someone who'd been growing food on this land for 40 years. Watching her grandmother explain the quince harvest to a group of attentive strangers, Diane felt something she hadn't expected, a fullness that had nothing to do with the business side of any of it. The feedback from that first weekend was enough to confer what Hector had suspected. People wanted this. Not just the technical knowledge, but the specific permission the farm seemed to offer, The evidence, living and visible and smelling of fermentation and fruit in good soil, that starting over was not a theoretical possibility, but a practical one with dirt under its fingernails. Diane ran 4 workshops that first year, then 6. Then she built a small outdoor teaching kitchen beside the greenhouse using salvaged timber and a corrugated metal roof, with a long work table down the center and proper ventilation and storage for equipment. She applied for and received a small business development grant through a Kentucky agricultural program that Hector had pointed her toward, which covered most of the construction cost. The farm's revenue picture changed shape over those 2 years. The Hollow Creek Provisions contract expanded to include the pear vinegar, which Linda had been asking about since the day she'd tasted it twice, and 2 new shrub varieties that had come out of Diane's ongoing product development. Workshop income added another substantial layer. Dr. Okafor's research partnership brought in a modest stipend for hosting graduate student fieldwork. The farm wasn't generating wealth, but it was generating enough, and enough felt like a different category of thing entirely from what Diane had been living with for the previous decade. Nana June's health held through most of it. At 81, she was slower than she'd been, but still sharp, still present in the greenhouse most mornings, still the person Diane checked in with at the end of each day, in the kitchen with tea and the evening news in the background. When June had a minor health scare in the second winter. Nothing serious, a respiratory infection that kept her indoors for 3 weeks. Diane hired a part-time helper from town named Carla, who came 4 mornings a week and quickly became indispensable to both of them. Owen came to visit in the spring of the second year. He drove out unannounced on a Saturday morning, which was either brave or oblivious, and stood in the driveway looking at the farm with an expression Diane couldn't immediately read. She came out of the barn, and they stood facing each other for a moment. "I should have come sooner," he said. "Yes," she said. She showed him around. He was quiet through most of it, the kind of quiet that meant he was recalibrating something. He tasted the apple cider vinegar straight from a small glass the way Linda and Dr. Okafor and everyone else who visited seemed to end up doing, and he set it down and looked at his sister and said, "Diane, this is something." "I know," she said without apology. They had a long conversation that afternoon, sitting on the porch while Nana June dozed in her chair inside. Owen didn't try to explain away his earlier skepticism, and Diane didn't make him perform regret. They talked about their parents and their childhood summers on the farm, and what it had meant to both of them in different ways. By the time he left, they hadn't resolved everything, but they'd started something honest, which was more than Diane had expected from the day. Priya visited that same month and stayed for a week, helping with a workshop session and spending the evenings at the kitchen table talking with Diane and Nana June in the particular warm, unhurried way that felt like what evenings were supposed to be for. Brett, as far as Diane knew, was doing fine. She'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that he was seeing someone new and had expanded his property management business into a second city. She wished him nothing. She thought about him rarely and without heat, the way you think about weather from a previous year. It happened. It had its effects. It was over. 2.5 years after pulling up that gravel driveway at 1:47 in the morning with a dead phone and no plan, Diane stood at the front of a workshop group of 18 people and watched them work at the long table in the outdoor kitchen. Hands in dough, noses bent over fermentation vessels, notebooks open, asking real questions and getting real answers, and felt the specific satisfaction of a life that was finally running in the right direction. Nana June's kitchen light was still on every morning when Diane came in from her first walk of the day. It had never gone off, not once since that first night. Diane had stopped thinking of it as a symbol and started thinking of it as just a fact about the farm. One of the things that was true here, reliable and quiet and constant, like the apple trees producing in autumn and the greenhouse holding heat through January and the slow amber work of fermentation proceeding in the barn regardless of what was happening outside its walls. She'd driven to this place with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and knowledge she'd nearly talked herself out of believing she still had. She'd built something from that. Not a perfect life. The legal fight had left marks. The estrangement from Owen had cost years she couldn't recover. The relationships she'd expected to hold hadn't always held. But a real life, genuinely hers, running on her own terms and soil she understood. At 44, she'd thought she was arriving somewhere as a last resort. She'd been arriving at a beginning. If you've ever set aside what you were good at because someone else's life seemed to need you more, if you've ever looked at the gap between who you trained to be and who you ended up becoming and felt the weight of that distance, if you've ever sat in a parked car in the dark and wondered what comes next, Diane's story is for you. Knowledge doesn't expire. The skills you set down are still there when you pick them back up. The hardest soil sometimes grows the most honest things. Share this with someone who needs to hear that the lights can still be on when you pull up the driveway. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.